All right, I think we're ready. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Radical Book Fair. I am so excited to be chairing this panel. All three of these books are sick. They're so good. We are going to have like a chat for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions, and then there will be a small signing table for our lovely three authors, so you can buy their books, get them signed. An exciting time. So I'm going to do a wee introduction of everyone, and then we'll have some questions, a little bit of readings, and it'll just be cute. It's going to be nice. It's going to be chill. So we have Silva, who is a writer and performer working in sound poetry, radio, and experimental nonfiction. Her debut poetry collection, Forms of Protest, was highly commended in the Forward Prizes, and her play for BBC Radio 4, An Artificially Intelligent Guide to Love, starred Fiona Shaw, which is very cool, and was the starting point for My Child, the Algorithm, which is her memoir on queer motherhood, which was co-written with her toddler and an AI, and it is mind-blowingly good. And then we have Sophie Chauhan, who is a London-based writer and researcher born in the UK and raised in Nam or Melbourne. She is completing a PhD in race, ethnicity, and postcolonial studies at University College London. Her academic, creative, and organizing work converge around her interest in anti-capitalist, queer, and decolonial approaches to radical coalition building, and Curious Affinities, which explores the political functions of intimacy through poetry and prose, is her first book. It is life-changing. I loved it. And then we have Lynne Segal, who is an Australian-born, British-based scholar, writer, and activist who has been publishing and editing books for many decades in the area of gender, sexuality, feminism, aging, and care. Her books include Is the Future Female?, Troubled Thoughts on Contemporary Feminism, Slow Motion, Changing Masculinities, Changing Men, and Straight Sex, The Politics of Pleasure. As part of the CARE Collective, she co-authored the CARE Manifesto, The Politics of Interdependence. So please join me in welcoming our authors. I can't really clap with this, I don't know why I'm trying. So, all three of you have written three very different books on intimacy. I am wondering if you could just start by telling me a little bit about your work and how it led you to writing on this topic. And I think a couple of you maybe want to do a little reading at this point to give a little taste of the book. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to read out a page or so. You're standing on my mic. Oh, no. Thank you. Thank you. So in the book, everything that's written by the algorithm is, when I say algorithm, I mean a precursor of ChatGPT. Everything written by that is in italics. When I read it out, I just kind of do this and put on a strange voice. Although I say I am writing this book with a machine learning algorithm and a toddler, in fact, I think that because I'm the one organising the material, I am the writer of this book, and the algorithm will not be getting any royalties. The toddler, however, will be eating, wearing, and playing with any royalties. The algorithm died, put on a suit, cut up its body, and said, goodbye. I can access a simple version of the algorithm online. I connect to the Wi-Fi using the password hipster cafes are like really cool, boring libraries, and pull up the web page. It consists of two boxes, one where you type in your questions or statements, and one underneath that displays the algorithm's response. I tell the algorithm, I want to think about love and queer parenting and bodies and failure, all right? The toddler has taken to adding all right to the end of his statements. Hit mummy, all right? I hit generate, which is a euphemism for right, or vice versa. And then I sit back against the wall of this Hackney cafe. After a few seconds, the algorithm responds. What is love? Is it an emotion? Is it an action? How does it work? What do we feel? What do we do? I'd suggest that you find out how to answer these questions. This is not just about writing, it is about real life. The answers are in your life. All right? Thanks. I'm so excited to read this now. Yeah, I'm also just going to read a part from, it's just a page-long preface to this book that explains, I just spent more time on this explanation than I would on the spot, so I'll go for that. Affinities happen where boundaries meet. With the touching of two exteriors, the promise of transgression and its fierce impossibility come to agonize, tumble, and embrace one another. These are the spaces where selves and collectivities are bounded and undone, where all things teem with entanglement and itch to take root in fresh soil. Yet debris also congeals in our fields of gravity. Treasures are flung into space. Spinning in the orbit of every new connection is the risk of its coming apart. The following pieces of writing explore different sites and scales of connection and disconnection. They represent an effort to map the vital work we make intimacy do, both in our private lives and in our politics. Proximity, distance, likeness, and difference inflect our relations in unexpected and generative ways, especially when it comes to family, race, love, migration, community, class, identity, and queerness. We are strung up, pulled apart, and stitched back together in the name of common feelings. But how much difference and distance can intimacy hold? How much proximity and likeness does it require? What learnings can be gleaned from its capacities, and what might we salvage from its limits? These are some of the questions that are braided through this book, albeit in roundabout ways. As for me, I've lived a very little life in the scheme of things. The affinities I speak of go to show it. And so I write from the world I know, equally small, and from my will to stretch it out to ask you in.
Hi, great to be here. And although I'd also like to be on the march, but it's nice seeing you there. So how are our books promoting different intimacies? Well, all my writing has been non-fiction, which is rather a pity in a way. I'd quite like to write some exciting fiction, but to read non-fiction, I think it's always good to be there yourself. You know, a lot of people say that fiction is always less true than non-fiction, that the author's always there with non-fiction, and I'm always trying to bring myself in as much as possible. And by the way, publishers always want that. So in my very latest book called Lean on Me, I'm looking back at over half a century of trying to promote radical ties between each other, but also in particular, radical encounters, revolutionary exchanges, how to create a better world. Every single book is really a sequel to the last book. I'm always just finding another way to do much the same thing, to say, let's get out there and try and improve things. But, the extraordinary thing for me is 50 years after all that engagement as a feminist, as a socialist, things keep getting worse. So, maybe we'll be discussing that. They do keep getting worse. And that's what I address in Lean on Me. How come, when we banded together, tried so hard, worked so hard for change, and won certain victories, but then other things undercut that, class, ethnicity, race, geography is always undercutting our attempts to empower everyone. So hopefully we'll be discussing that.
So kind of thinking of this idea, all three of you have written obviously non-fiction, but what's really interesting about these three books in conversation with each other is that they all disrupt, in a way, the typical non-fiction book, either through blending poetry and prose like you do, the algorithm, or the kind of memoir that you bring into your book, Lynne. And I'm curious how you wanted to use this kind of disruptive form of writing to kind of think about disruptive forms of intimacy. Why was not writing just a straight up nonfiction, fact book important in how you want to think about these ideas? It's over to anyone.
The process of writing this book was for me a process of undisciplining my voice as a writer. I'm now in my 6th year of higher education, where I've learned how to very systematically and formulaically construct my ideas through an academic framework. And I had a gap between finishing my master's and starting my PhD, where the bulk of this was written. And I emphatically chose to spend the whole year reading only fiction and poetry, and lots of it, because I was like, it's always like what Lynne was saying just now, actually. I want to metabolize the sorts of ideas and different points of entry for understanding these complex issues in a way that means that my input and output have to speak to one another. And actually, lots of the themes in this book fit very closely. They kind of dovetail with stuff that I look at in my research, which is about anti-racist coalition building, broadly speaking. But I understood that there were certain aspects of those concepts that explanation can't access as a way of thinking, as a way of writing, or even as like an experiential approach that can't be properly interpreted through that mode. So a lot of the time I arrived at form not deliberately. I wasn't saying I'm going to write a poem about X, Y, Z, but when I started attacking different points of entry through feelings or memories, experiences, even sometimes just the resonance of certain words or phrases, I would come to approach and feel closer to the thing that I was trying to describe or explore in ways that the very formulaic non-fiction prose style that I'd been disciplined into wouldn't allow for. I think with this book I started to find a way of writing that reflects the way I think. And since writing the book, I got diagnosed as autistic. And when I look back at the book, I see all these, all the glitches and the repetitions and everything that drew me to the algorithm, because the algorithm that I was using was one that failed and not one that's very normative like today's. So I found that this way of interacting with the algorithm and also with my toddler, it represents the life that we have around us and all the language that we are being bombarded with all the time, and that it's sometimes difficult to filter out, and it's all happening simultaneously. And then we have a layer of thought and of desire and all the subtext and all the things that you're not allowed to say. And I found it was finding a way of allowing all of those layers to coexist and speak to each other. And the algorithm moved me when it started getting stuck and glitching on phrases. Like it glitched on, I will go on my own and I will be fine. I will go on my own and I will be fine. Which was a way of walking into talking about being on my own as a single parent and being fine, or not. But having these kind of loops going around my head. It was also really funny sometimes. Like I asked it to write a scene depicting a codependent relationship between two women in love, and it wrote breasts, 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 265 times, and then concluded all women in love. So, for me it was just like finding a way of writing that reflects my life and my way of thinking, and wanting to write a book that is very much like the reader is walking with me in a present.
Yes, I'd say, we're always thinking, and certainly as feminists have always talked about the way in which the personal is political. How does the personal connect to the political? Or for me, in psychosocial studies, how does the inner connect with the outer? And of course, they're not two separate spheres. They're always entwined with each other. And we think about, what's the bridge between them, but that bridge has always already been crossed. We're always, formed by everything around us. So, back in the 1970s, which I write about in today's Guardian, by the way, we formed consciousness-raising groups and things like that to talk about the inner, to talk about our personal pains and sorrows. And then, of course, the whole point of that was precisely to say, oh, I see you. Oh, yeah, that's what I think. Oh, yeah, that happened to me. And so, of course, that will happen to other people. Although, again, it will be within social context, within the particular forms of belonging that we have, or the exclusions that we've faced. All those things will mean that the two worlds, the inner and outer, and the personal and political, are not separate, but just trying to see what is this complex intertwining between them, I'd say is what I try and discuss in each sequel that I write.
There's definitely like a fluidity with which you all kind of talk about this like approach to genres. And it makes me think of that first sentence that you read, Sophie, this idea of like affinities happen when boundaries meet. And I'm interested in this idea of a boundary space as something that can both keep things out and also let things in, which is maybe not how we normally think of boundaries as something like rigid and exclusionary. And I'm interested in how we can potentially co-opt boundary spaces as something that is filled with possibility rather than something that is about like rejection or exclusion.
I could say something about identities. You know, we hear a lot about identity politics. And, you know, for some people, identity politics is a problem and stops you recognizing class or race or something else. But actually, many of us form our identities precisely in resistance. You know, so I become a feminist because I'm not happy about the way in which I'm seen as a woman. Or becoming a mother, you know, we want to precisely combat all the ways in which mothers have been situated. I mean, that's one thing that led to second wave feminism, the isolation and marginalization of mothers. And second wave feminists, by the way, have been accused of rejecting motherhood and ignoring their children, when in fact, you know, we really did begin to change things for the better around children, for mothers, for creating more nurseries and so on, and then that all gets beaten back once you get Tory governments in control. And so, you know, seeing how identities in resistance. In fact, I became a Jew. I'd never thought of myself much as a Jew, but I became a Jew in order to criticize the militant Zionist politics of Israel and its occupation and treatment of the Palestinians. And also then I formed friends with some Israeli Jews who are having such a terrible time nowadays and so getting smaller and smaller, less than 5%, I believe. So, you know, our identities are always something that is formed in peculiar ways, which when we unpack it, you often find they are identities in resistance. And that's the borderland, I think, that you're describing.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. And around motherhood and mothering, which I try to say parenting actually, but it always gets reframed as mothering. But I do it to myself as well because I think I got mummified, which I've like, this is my coined phrase. And you do get mummified, as a parent. So I think like part of, and I'd had such narratives, especially from my mother, that or my parents, that you know that you kind of make a choice. You can have a kid or you can have a career. And my mum's a feminist, but that was still the narrative that I grew up with. And then I gave birth, and I was like, whoa, I've still got a mind. Like, I can still write, I can still think, and actually my thinking and writing were transformed in, I think, really exciting ways. Obviously, there's a year of you know, terror and stuff. Whatever. But also that like language play and you know all of the things that I enjoy as a writer are things that my child is engaging with and discovering the world and like tasting sounds and then starting to form words and language and phrases and being so playful and mucking about with language in a way that creates poetry. You know, like there's one of my favorite lines in the book is he brings a box to me and says, "What's in the box?" And I go, "Nothing, is empty." Drops it on the floor. It's not empty. There's a noise in it. But like, yeah, so I don't know. Like, yeah, that there are not such rigid boundaries between us as parents and also us as sexual people, which I think somehow still doesn't get talked about too much. Like, if you're a new mother, you're not supposed to want to go and date people and have great sex. So I definitely make sure that's in my book. I mean, it's not compartmentalized in that kind of a way. But there's also a line in terms of boundaries. The algorithm says boundaries allow you to say yes, boundaries allow you to say no. And I think we can, you know, especially if we're quite vulnerable, we can really erect boundaries to protect us. But it's very hard to then let those boundaries down and go when we don't always need them. You know, our boundaries don't have facial recognition. Yeah. Neither does AI very well. That's another point.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting in what both of you have said, which is that we actually experience this idea of identities or any singular type of existence when the edges of it are pressed upon or broken through, like this idea of like a career or like a career woman or a mother, or even that like it's experiences of misogyny that actually activate your sense of being a woman in many ways. Because I think something that I'm really interested in is how, I suppose, when we come to understand ourselves through experiences of oppression, our investment in restoring our own humanity is often also an investment in upholding those identity categories and fortifying them in ways. And that comes from a place of political necessity, but I think also can constrain us from within as well. That it's like erecting walls that are protective, but also can imprison us in certain ways. But also, like, returning to your question, I've recently become really obsessed with, sometimes I'll like look up the background of a word and get so excited by it, but the word liminal, like this notion of a boundary space or a border space or in-betweenness, actually comes from the Latin word for a threshold, which isn't about being nowhere or on both sides or whatever. It's actually something that's structured into a building that plays a role, exactly like you said, Anahit, in keeping things in or out, but does have a stable position within it. I think that's something that, when I think about the ways that we mobilize political difference or exclusion, for better or for worse, we also need to think about the way that that's a position that's structured into the systems we live in. It's not always necessarily outside or inside or that simple.
There's something also very queer as a practice about that, right? Of kind of breaking down these boundaries and allowing this kind of like fluidity between these kind of spaces. All three of these books are queer in kind of quite particular different ways. And in your book, Hannah, there's this bit which I really loved where you talked about like, I have done things in a queer order, in this kind of resistance of like marriage, the nuclear family, this kind of teleology that we're kind of expected to have. I'm curious what you think queered forms of intimacy can offer us, and specifically how they might restructure or reimagine kind of what is already there. What is important not just about the queer relationship as a kind of unit, but about a queer form of relating kind of structurally or socially, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's that, phrasing it as a queer relationship as a form of unit is perhaps less queer. Because I think for me there was a shift, although I had a relationship with a woman, like it's only since we've separated that I feel like I've become more queer in the way in which I live and go about relationships and friendships, and that we can have these relationships and we can queer our friendships and we can become, obviously chosen family is a word. I'm also quite a fan of the idea of abolishing the family, though. Which is Sophie Lewis talks about that. I think another thing that needs to shift a lot within parenting and also within relationships is, it's currently you still get 2 parents on a birth certificate, but people can apply to have more than that. And I've encountered families with 4 parents who are actually doing it equally, which is beautiful. And it makes no sense to me that we go about parenting from a position of romance. It's really something that needs to have some very non-romantic conversations and calmness. It shouldn't be a little romantic urge. So when I look back at how I did it, I think that makes no sense at all. And then I've met parents, like multiple parents, who sit down and work everything out and write it all down and figure out all of their values and how they're going to go about it. So kind of taking parenting out of romance. It might be a way to put romance into parenting. Developing friendships, developing romantic friendships. I love romantic friendships. I love going on dates with my friends. I love not breaking out of monogamy and all that way of thinking. These kind of narratives that get embedded in us, both in terms of meeting the one and all that kind of thing, but also in terms of parents, step-parents. We've still got the evil step-parent narrative, even in contemporary fairy tales. I've got a friend of mine who is also an ex, now collects my kid once a week. And she did like message me recently and say, you know, we thought we were doing that queer chosen family thing. Actually, it's just that I'm Northern. Which is kind of a point. But, you know, London is particularly problematic for it's kind of like you're saying, Lynn, about, you know, this system hasn't been changed. It hasn't been disrupted on that base level. Like, it's still set up that the only way of surviving is within this nuclear family in this house. And although many of us want to survive differently and live differently, all of the structures are against you, increasingly, and more and more so every year, I think.
I really like what you've done there, Hannah, to expand the idea that queerness is often seen as this interpersonal dynamic. I don't write about it explicitly in here, but something that I found really kind of revelatory was recognizing that like when you're coming out in a teenager, your experience feels very singular, and that especially when you feel a sense of like generational difference if you're raised in like a heteronormative household. But something I've come to understand gradually is that like my parents had a very controversial union because of like race and cultural divides between them. And then both of their grandparents on my mum's side, there was a class divide that made their marriage very unpopular. On my dad's side, it was a caste difference that made it unpopular. And this generational thread of like controversial, divisive, and in many ways like subversive and countercultural marriages or unions or like expressions of love and dedication and relationships, whatever, actually showed more continuity than difference. And I mean, I wouldn't naturally think to call those like queer partnerships or whatever, because I don't know how valuable it is stretching that category. But at the same time, the kind of recognition that I can access now in terms of intergenerational threads and continuities and points of connection is so distant from the notion of separation and division that I experienced coming out as a teenager and feeling like, how could they possibly understand me in like very, very typical sense. But yeah, I think absolutely that when like there are multiple ways of bending and distorting and disrupting ideas about like what the family is, and they don't always seem apparent when we approach it through one lens, but when we do open up to the possibility of other strategies and other worldviews when it comes to unpicking these hegemonic systems, it can be really enlightening, I think.
Yes. I think one thing to think about, whether we're thinking in terms of queer identities or radical politics and identities, is how quickly prescriptiveness can creep into that. A number of people have written about that very well. Joan Nessel in A Restricted Country, and Jonathan Dollymore more recently in his book on desire, that once you have a particular radical identity, then there are certain norms connected with that. You know, so for my second generation of feminists, penetrative sex was always something horrible that, if you read Dworkin, undermined our insides and automatically made us inferior beings. Really? But penetrative, I mean, kissing, tongue, you know, and so, like, you have to immediately take a step back from any identity or any way of looking at the world to deconstruct it, as we know, the Druidians would say, and see just how complicated it is. So I wrote a book in the 1990s called Straight Sex, because within the women's movement, within feminism, you actually couldn't talk about heterosexuality. That was always going to be a bad thing. And we were relying on certain lesbian feminists, including B. Campbell and others, to say, or Joan Nessel wrote a wonderful article called My Mother Liked to Fuck. And it was published in City Limits, and City Limits was occupied by other feminists. How dare she say her mother liked to fuck? Nobody likes to fuck or be fucked. And so, you know, it's always being open to contradiction and complexity. That's what, you know, the most interesting, and the most sexy people always are. And to me, as a sex radical, Joan Nessel is way out there, way ahead, you know, because she just talks about all those contradictions which we have to take on board. And the more we take them on board, then the more we open ourselves up to new excitements and possible new pleasures, but also knowing pleasures also is about pain. I mean, you don't have one without the other, and no possibilities of loss and so on. And so, you know, always being there for each other, but knowing, you know, this isn't going to be easy, and always being prepared to take that step back and say, but am I right then? Maybe I'm wrong. Listen, always be listening to people who are disagreeing with you and suspicious of people who are being very dogmatic, even about the nature of queer.
It makes me this discussion makes me think a lot about potentially the limits of and this is always a really tricky thing. I think I've talked about this a lot, and I'm starting to worry I come across as anti-queer marriage, which is not what I mean. But the limits of kind of normalizing particular relationships within kind of traditionally patriarchal heteronormative structures. And I think there's a bit in your book, Sophie, where you talk about the queer marriage vote in Australia and about what does it mean to kind of be putting something within what is actually quite a violent institution, which is marriage. And I'm curious to what extent you think queer structures of intimacy, whether that is queer families, whether that's mutual aid even, whether they only hold radical power because they exist on the fringes of state power and state institution. And if we kind of bring this stuff into the kind of norm, does it lose that power? Or is that itself quite a violent way of thinking about it? It's something that I am still trying to think through.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. I have a stupid bit I do with my friends, which is when we were teenagers, we'd call our long-term partners our wives, our girlfriends our wives, because it was before marriage equality happened, so it was haha, a joke. And now, I keep finding out that people think I'm married because I call my girlfriend my wife, but because I think it's funny. Yeah, I do. It's interesting you talked about the Australian queer marriage vote, because it wasn't called that. It was called the same-sex marriage referendum, which I think explains everything. I actually really lament the fact that even I came out very young, and I had to let go of this narrative that I had indulged myself and other people had imposed on me, but it was very much made in conversation. I was invested in it, of this life trajectory I was going to have that was going to be shaped by the idea of this perfect heterosexual union. And that rupture at that point in my life opened up so many possibilities for imagining different ways of living, of not having to subscribe to a particular narrative arc, of imagining different ways of relating and centering friendship or sexual or romantic or platonic relationships in my life. And I really lament the fact, and this probably sounds cynical, but I do mean it. I really lament the fact that children coming out today with marriage equality in place are probably not going to experience that, or not in the same way, because they've been granted access to the same disciplining institutional norms that marriage provides. I'm on side with Hannah. I definitely call myself a family abolitionist. I just think that when we have these taken for granted categories that are taken for granted for straight people, I don't think, while for queer people or any other group that's being integrated or incorporated in those institutions, seeking out things that are taken for granted for dominant people certainly has appeal because it offers a kind of comfort, but I think we should always be skeptical of that comfort and what we have to give up in order to seek it in terms of radical ways of imagining, in terms of alternative possible futures. Because I do really believe in the idea of prefigurative politics, that we can find ways under systems that try to encroach on every aspect of our lives. We can find ways to live differently under whatever constraints, and model how we would live in a better future in the present. And that's something that I think if we understand queerness as being like outside of norms or in opposition to or in some kind of subversive relationship to norms, that we should lean into and really, really kick up a fuss when we're asked to give it up. Yeah.
You know, our 60s generation, because I came into adulthood in the 60s, smash the family after David Cooper was one slogan. And of course, smash the family was very much criticized by some people as ignoring class, ignoring race, all those places where you don't have a welfare state, where the family, might be all that people feel they have as a form of protection against external racism or poverty and so on. So, although I've written about the family very critically, What is to be Done About the Family, which was a collection that came out in the 80s, I feel wary of simply smash the family or abolish the family, but certainly open up the family. Everyone can be family. And the interesting thing for feminists and women generally is that it does seem that our intimate attachments and our erotic life is more fluid as women. That's what Adrienne Rich wrote about. There was a book by Lisa Diamond called Sexual Fluidity, in which she points out, that it's much less easy to predict the final outcome of women's attachments than it is men's. And I remember Adam Phillips, the psychoanalyst, reviewing Lisa Diamond's book, saying, pity the poor man who, once he's a straight man, is always going to be a straight man. Or look at Foucault, once he's a gay man, always has to be affirming his gay malehood. And whereas there is more fluidity in women's attachments, and how wonderful that is. So again, opening up, overcoming barriers, not having any really fixed identity seems to me the way forward. So always to be questioning, opening out, encompassing, and of course nuclear families are not meant to be doing that. Nuclear families are meant to have one fixed form, and actually they don't and never did. In fact, people say it's only sort of post-war that you got this really narrowed down family. In other places, other spaces, as anthropologists are always telling us, there's very many forms of kinship that doesn't boil down to that minute little suburban home that people like me were brought up in which the parents did nothing but squabble. And, second wave feminism just had to come along as a way to escape that. So, well, it's why I write about care, I suppose. We talk about, in our care manifesto, which came out of this book, Lean on Me, and held it up for a while, because friends said, we're interested in care too. We want to help you write your book. We'll form a collective to read about care. And then they said, we want to write about care. So then we wrote the care manifesto, and my book got pushed aside for a little while. But there we introduced the notion of promiscuous care, like promiscuous love, which is not about fleeting love or short attachments, but it's about seeing, we all need to care for each other. No, there should be no exclusions from care. We all need to be involved in care. Always, of course, women have been far more involved in care than men have. And increasingly today, care is racialized because both men and women are out there in the workforce causing this crisis of care. And so we import third world women to do our caring, paying them next to nothing, and with a stigma still attached to care. So care used to be stigmatized because it was women's work. Now it's increasingly stigmatized because it's underpaid work that migrants do. And it's also, by the way, one of the main sources of profit for those financial companies who are buying up elderly care homes, buying up children's homes and so on, and in many ways leveraging them for further capital. And care is just getting worse and worse for most people, which Lynne Segal, which one of you know, Lynne Segal writes all about. If you're in a care home, you're not being cared for. And that's the state. Why? That's the state. That care is something that you're still in our heads is this private thing done in nuclear families by women. That's not what's happening. That's not how care is being done. But we haven't reconstructed our language and our thinking, and certainly not our ways of working, which means shorter working time for everyone, universal income and so on, so we could all be engaged in the work of caring and loving. So all that is part of what I tried to write about.
Yeah, absolutely true. I went on a date with a Brazilian woman the other day who was working with one of these companies, which is basically people trafficking, and the hours that she was working and the lack of breaks, it really, really shocked me. And yeah, this is really happening, and no training, of course, and no support. It's appalling. I don't know, there's so many things here, like, on marriage and all of that. I don't know, I'll come at it from a few. I mean, obviously, I think it's important to have the equal rights. You know, we all need to fight for that everywhere, and there are many places where that's not the case still, and it's appalling. I got married to a man from Mexico, and if we hadn't got married, we wouldn't have been able to stay together. And that was like my trajectory until I did things in a different order. So I basically retired with my husband in the countryside when I was in my 20s. Yeah. But when we separated, we had to list my unreasonable behaviour. We both had different partners by this point, but we listed my unreasonable behaviour because we couldn't list infidelity, because even within divorce laws now, they still haven't updated the law. So infidelity is sex between two people of the opposite sex. That is still in our law, although we've got same-sex marriage. You know, so yeah, like all of that needs to shift. And I mean, again, I think marriage can be a very terrifying institution, and everybody goes around saying it's all about unconditional love, as if that's a beautiful romantic thing. A love without conditions is terrifying. Like, we must have conditions and we must stick to them. Yeah. We can have unconditional love with our children. That's something different. Yeah. Yeah. But also that, and again, I agree with Lynne. Like, I love, Jose Munoz says we need to risk utopianism if we're going to engage in the labour of creating a queer world, I think. So I like to imagine utopianism, and I like to read these books that are manifestos for, you know, different modes of living. But I also know I have every sympathy for anybody who goes, this is too hard, I'm going to get a partner, I'm going to live in a flat with this partner, and I'm going to get on this scheme, I'm going to do, you know, I feel that urge myself. We don't have other models, particularly in a city like London, where everyone is spread out and everybody is barely surviving. I'm not living really in good alternative models, and it's getting harder and harder. So, you know, I have every sympathy for anybody who's going, this is actually the only way of surviving.
Yeah, like the nuclear family is actively incentivized within like our society. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to hand it over to you, so please get thinking. So it'll just be quite a brief one, but I did really want to ask this because I was really struck, and I wasn't expecting it when I read the three of them, but like how sexy these books are. They're like really hot, and there's this like a few poems in yours, Sophie, that I have actively used to flirt with people in the last month. Like, it's like a good vibe. And I am curious how we might start rethinking about female desire as a radical or like a subversive force. So like just, maybe like a tiny bit on that, and then I will hand over to you guys.
I'm happy to start because I actually have just like a couple paragraphs to read that I think address this. Because for me, it was really transformative encountering Audre Lorde's essay, like the uses of the erotic as power. And I wrote about the first encounter with that essay in here, and I feel like it addresses that. So it's part of the last essay in the book. Okay, Scene 5, the yes within ourselves. When you're 16, you read Audre Lorde's essay, Uses of the erotic as power, and your virgin mind is blown. It speaks to whatever intensity is broiling in your guts, that thing that is not any one thing, but seems to contain the entire scope of humanity, including its rough edges. Lorde's eros, the natural derivative of chaos, is somehow expansive enough to contain all of this. What a miracle of timing. Just like that, she rids you of the need to hack the rational free from the emotional, the spiritual from the political. Eros animates all, and your number one priority is to let it course through you freely, to be animated. Some years later, it sometimes makes you sad to know that you won't access that hotbed of feeling again. It was somehow at once the most devastating and enlivening thing to have crossed your path. At points in your life, when you're numb to the world, you fear that you have lost it forever. You crave hurt just to touch the intensity. But feeling, much like numbness, is a learned capacity. You remember it takes practice and quickly get to work. At 16, your concept of Eros had more to do with frustration and outpour than it does to you now. You have known it in subtle forms. You are yet to know much of its range. But you feel it in the crowd, the hum of energy that builds on the first scoping circuit of a dance floor, the way your joints disappear in the smoke, the meeting of eyes at the seminar, at the rally, that says everything without giving it away. Eros is the potential energy of scheming, of organizing, of chatting shit, of getting shit done. When the protest moves as a mass to stop traffic, Eros is the spontaneous arrival of common knowledge at the scene. More and more these days, you enter rooms full of familiar faces, and Eros lets you all breathe the same air. It is the rhythm to this life that rolls so deep, you meet it first through the soles of your shoes. Audre Lorde said, "In touch with the erotic, I become less willing to accept powerlessness or those other supplied states of being which are not native to me, such as resignation, despair, self-effacement, depression, self-denial." So at 16, you scavenged for Eros, drank up every scarce drop, quenched your thirst. You made it your mission to metabolize love by embracing, quote, "this mode of living and sensation." Today, when you come back to the beat-up volume, the smell of its pages sets you alight. You live it now, you sense it.
I would say, it's nice listening to that. I would say many things. One could begin by thinking of Leo Bassani's claim that the big secret about sex is that most people don't like it. Now, I don't completely agree with that at all. I think the big secret about sex is one that Laplanche talked about, which is that desire is always sort of this active going out to get what you want. Desire, he says, it begins as passive. You want to be embraced, loved, stroked. Bassani, obliterated. Things have to be dramatic for Bassani. But how gender is created is actually around desire and the idea that men are active, women are passive. That is the heterosexual act. Now, of course, if that's really what's going on, then no wonder most people don't like it. Because in fact, we do want to be embraced, taken. We want to, desire, I think Laplanche is right, is certainly as much passive as active. But what Joan Nestle, who I mentioned before, talked about is, as a femme, as a lesbian femme, I beam my desire. And she feels a bit sorry for the butchers who have to go and act and give her what she wants, But, so, breaking through that ridiculous binary of active-passive and reclaiming passivity, reclaiming just being able to be there, loved and taken and so on is one way of thinking about desire, which becomes immediately revolutionary, it seems to me, as well as breaking the boundaries of gender.
Yeah, that also makes me think about, distance. Desire is it's in the imagination and it's in the distance. I quote a conversation that I had with my ex in this book where I was pregnant and she said, "What would you do if I left you?" And I said, "I would have lots of sex." And she said, "I thought you said you're going to kill yourself." So that kind of prefaces my sex party chapter. However, I think actually the sexiest moment in this book, you may disagree, there's a chapter with a friend, a very close friend of mine who I also collaborate with, and it's a chapter that the algorithm is exploring gender binaries, and my friend is living this, not talking about it, but living and going through a lot of feelings around their body. And there's a moment at the end of the chapter where we say goodbye and we embrace and we hold on to each other for a long time. And then as we walk away from each other, I just say, she stands up, brushes herself off, turns aside, reflects. We've switched, so I give my gender in that embrace moment. So I don't know, I think that's a moment of intimacy. Yeah,
for sure. Okay, all right, thank you so much. I'm gonna hand this over. I think, sorry, we have run over, we only have time for probably a couple of questions, but I'm gonna hand this, and then.
One here, yeah. There you go.
Sorry. Hi, that was really good. I was involved in a lot of mutual aid stuff over the pandemic, and also was a carer right before the pandemic.
A bit higher.
Oh, sorry. I was a carer right before the pandemic, and then was involved in a lot of mutual aid stuff, and gained intimacy with a lot of people that I normally wouldn't, like older people, and just people who I never would have interacted with. Do you think it's possible to maintain that intimacy with people who aren't in your tribe or your social circles or your geography when there's not something like a pandemic happening? And how do we do that, I guess?
Do you want us to answer each question? Or?
I would I think it is possible, and I think it's different for different people, and you find your own way. I have a friend who I don't see very often, but we are reading each other the letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West, and we just exchange letters. And we find. I think and the other thing that the pandemic shifted with many of us, I think it was different ways of communicating and feeling close. That's my quick answer. But I think it's hard. I think it's really hard. And I think especially when somebody's struggling and actually needs physical support, which I experience quite a lot. And, that's a real problem in our society still, yeah.
Well, I hope it's possible, because when you get to my age, which is 80, your friends start dying, or they become bedridden, and more and more you're going to depend on younger friends or other people to have your, for your intimate ties. And I do think it's possible. Of course it's possible. I mean, that's what I hope to write about next, really. Cross-generational encounters, radical friendships, cross-generational encounters. But of course, they'll always be challenging. Cross-ethnicity, cross-race, people have written a lot about it, but we know that it is possible, as soon as we start really opening ourselves up to thinking about it. And I'm glad you talked about mutual aid, because I do think of all the terrible things that have happened, particularly since 2010, the good things that happened since the pandemic, and nice to see you all in your masks there, was the growth of mutual aid, something originally an anarchist concept associated with Kropotkin. But mutual aid, really emerged then. And the worry is that, it's now we're all going to be back working all hours in the workforce, and mutual aid will go, except around food banks or limited places. But I don't think that's so. I think we have, for instance, near me, a cafe called the Second Chance Cafe, and I think there's lots of things like that where you can have free meals, and there's spaces for creating intimacy, and they do work. And I quite like the slogan, mutual care, not self-care, but I think we want mutual care and self-care, and I do think it is possible to work for that. Self-care via mutual care, but the state and our local councils and so on, our local communities have to support that. So it can't just be down to us and our interpersonal activity. We also have to have spaces provided by local government, provided by government, and that's, of course, what's always been closed down, public spaces. How do we fight for public spaces and money to go into the creation of mutual care and places where we can meet and fall in love or just care for each other?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think Lynne's exactly right that COVID provided an entry point where necessity kicked in and it wasn't dependent on desire or compassion, because in a quite unique way, like everybody's sense of normal was disrupted, and everyone did have this kind of crisis mentality happening. But I think actually, in many ways, if we're to look at material conditions in lots of people's lives, like the crises we're facing presently are more intense, more destructive, like similarly morbid, and whereas the pandemic had that element of the unknown to it, the trajectories of our current crises are far more predictable. Like, if things continue, they are going to get continually worse. So I absolutely think that the sorts of infrastructure and skill sharing and experience that everyone gained from pandemic mutual aid efforts is continuing and has to continue. But I think it's also a matter of like retraining our attention to the ways that crisis manifests in circumstances that we've been taught to accept as normal. Because to me, that's the difference between like a COVID lockdown and a homelessness crisis or a border crisis. It's that some of those are exceptional in our like collective imagination, and others are taken for granted conditions that we're taught to ignore. I think it's a matter of like retraining our attention, because when we recognize those as the crises that they are, that sense of necessity has to return.
Thank you so much. Okay, all right. I think we will leave it there because that is probably also, yeah, that is time. So we're going to be doing a quick signing at the back, and there are more events on also through the day if you want to say. I will say the pro-Palestine march is currently happening, and I am going to run off there like pretty swiftly. So if you have an afternoon free, I would very much encourage you to go. I think they were collecting at Waverley Bridge, but they've probably drifted off somewhere, but I'm sure it will be trackable. So yeah, I would very much encourage people to go if you have the time. And yeah, thank you so much to wonderful 3 panelists, and yeah.
Thank you. We're going to sign books so that you can buy your books later if you want to. Although it would be nice to meet you.